recently moved here to Louisville, and my dear friend is the fellow that helped me walk across the country, Drew Allgaier. And some of you all, if you've watched any of our videos, you've heard me talk about Drew and you've seen. He introduced me to Laura. Laura introduced me to Saul. Saul and Laura invited me on their radio show to be their first guest, because their show had only been on the air about 3 months. And they interviewed me when I was sitting under a tree at an RV park in West Sacramento, California, 2 days before I finished the hike and made it, the bike and hike, and made it to California. We had tried to connect prior to that and had all kinds of technical difficulties, starting all the way back in Colorado. I finally got the interview done then. But back in Colorado, when we had the technical difficulties, by synchronicity, I wound up having an hour-long phone conversation with Saul, because we were the only two that were able to dial in and get onto this conference call. The other two people never could get in. I didn't know Saul. I knew Laura, and I knew the other gentleman that supports her. So Saul and I have this conversation, and he tells me his story. And his story is really about that level of healing underneath it all, down at the level of spirit. And I won't go into a ton of detail about the methodology, but basically it has to do with DNA. And Saul's theory is that the DNA in a human being and in all sentient beings is the bridge, the communication conduit between the spiritual level of reality and the physical level of reality. That for many of us, it's not a shocking statement to say something like, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. There's something far deeper and more magical and more mystical and more powerful that each one of us is made up of than just our physical bodies. I mean, our physical bodies are miracles in and of themselves, but there's something deeper than that. And that's what Saul's book is about. It's about the research about what really is DNA. And is it really true that 97% of our DNA is what's called junk DNA? Or, I mean, is there any part of the human body that was a mistake? Oh, I just threw this organ in, you really don't need it. And nature just created it by mistake. You know, honestly, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I find it really offensive, a lot of the attitude of allopathic medicine, in that the human body is some mess up and we have to have this heroic intervention to come in and fix it. When the terrain is kept balanced, and I'm not saying there aren't exceptions, you know, trauma medicine is amazing, and the advancements in that, and a lot of allopathic medicine from a healing perspective is really amazing too. But I, for one, do not believe that there was some deep mistake made in the human design that needs heroic intervention constantly for all of us in order for us to survive and thrive. Why are we here hundreds of thousands of years later, or thousands of years later, whatever your belief system, instead of being extinct long before we ever got to the last 100 years? So I don't believe, and Saul doesn't either, and he writes very eloquently in his book that 97% of our DNA is junk. 97% of our DNA just may not be turned on yet. We haven't learned yet how to tap into it and access it, but that it could be a key to that deeper level of healing that each one of us individually has the capacity to activate, and not necessarily rely on the intervention of an outside person, source, solution to bring us healing. And he's not saying it's an either or, it's a both and. So he refers to the biochemical level of healing in reality as Era 1 medicine. Era 2 medicine, era being E-R-A, the era, the first era of medicine. Era 2 medicine would be more like what Rife was trying to do. If you guys familiar, you probably are, with a guy named Dr. Bruce Lipton. There's a really good lecture he gives, and we've got it on our website. He wrote a book called The Biology of Belief. And he's a Stanford-trained biologist. He taught at Stanford for 20 plus years. But he got into being one of the pioneer biologists in an area of biology, an emerging area called epigenetics, meaning above genetics. That's what epi means. And what it's basically saying is we are not the victims of our genes. That he uses the analogy, genes are like a blueprint. And just because you have the blueprint of your home in your hands does not mean your home is going to be built just like that, right? You got a thing called an eraser, you can change it. The same with genes, that genes express because of the terrain that they're living within. So in certain terrain, a gene may express as a proclivity for cancer or MS or whatever. But change the terrain and you change the expression of the gene, as it's called. So epigenetics is what we would call era 2 medicine, along with what White was talking about. That all of the terrain, including your mental terrain, your emotional terrain, your attitude, has an overarching effect on the biochemical level. It's more substantial, meaning underlying, than the biochemistry level. Both of the levels of healing are important, though. This doesn't mean you don't stop eating your greens because you're thinking positive thoughts or you're doing meditation. It's both and. Both and. What Saul is writing about is adding in the third era. Era 3 medicine, he calls it light or sound-based medicine. And one of the protocols he's teaching right now is using sound, primarily the human voice, the sound of the human voice, to activate a whole other level of healing. So we're probably all familiar with the phrase from the Bible, in the beginning there was the Word. And what many, many researchers, writers, spiritual teachers have talked about is that doesn't mean the written word, that means the sound. That means the vibration of the universe is the substantial level of creation. That, as Tesla said, if you want to understand the nature of the universe, think in terms of energy, vibration, and frequency. So that's what Saul is writing about, and it really, really struck me when I got to know Saul. He spontaneously didn't know my story other than reading a little summary of it. In the episode before they interviewed me, he started talking about Lyme disease. He started talking about biofilms. He started talking about biofilms as a key to Lyme disease, which I think we all know. A key to chronic Lyme disease is definitely one of the smoking guns to why this is such a persistent. And biofilms aren't unique to Lyme disease. There are a lot of other pathogens out there that they're taking advantage of that protective nature to be able to persist in the body. And so when I got to talk with Saul and basically we become long distance friends and then read his book, I really felt called to try and start studying this and trying to practice it. He teaches in his book a way that you can do an energetic practice using sound to facilitate and help support your own healing. It's called potentiation, and I performed my own potentiation about 3 weeks ago. And if any of you guys have an interest, I'm going to give a talk that goes into detail about Saul's work at a place called the Louisville Esoteric Society. It's a local group I belong to. Sometime after the first of the year. We haven't scheduled it yet, but I'm going to try to go into more detail on what I understand about this Era 3 healing and the sound-based technologies that could be another piece, another tool in our toolkit. That's all he's talking about. So if you want to come hear more about it, I'm going to speak more about it. And then I'm actually going to invite anybody that would like to come to a follow-up session after that lecture to come back, and we'll actually do a session of that healing. His book teaches you again how to do it. It includes using a tuning fork with a very specific frequency and a series of chants using the human voice. The human voice is a very, very powerful. We know, you can speak black magic or healing magic with your own words. And the word definitely has power, but it's not just what we speak, it's how we speak it, it's what energy we put behind it. Again, different layers of vibration, frequency, and energy that have a power. So I will let you guys know when we get that scheduled, and it's all free. It's just part of the learning process. But for whatever reason, I felt it deeply in my gut, intuitively, as I got introduced to this information. Shortly thereafter, I watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind again with my sister and brother-in-law and my nieces. And there's that scene where Richard Dreyfuss keeps drawing the same sketch over and over again and makes it out of clay and does it with shaving cream and mashed potatoes. And what he's making in the movie is a model of Devil's Tower where the aliens are going to come land. But he has no idea why he keeps making that sketch and making that figure, but he looks at it and he looks at his family and he says, this means something. And immediately when I read Saul's book, that's the vision that came into my mind, is this means something. And Saul's work is not unique to Saul. DNA, energy, sound vibrational healing is being taught and explored and researched all over the planet in a number of different ways. DNA activation in different ways is a part of what he's teaching. But, I don't think it's a coincidence why that's happening. Why an idea maybe whose time has come seems to be coming in through a lot of minds and a lot of channels throughout the planet. Because there's got to be something more here. Because most of us that have tried every form of biochemical healing, Era 1, and even a lot of forms of Era 2 healing, we still don't see these diseases being vaporized. And what keeps coming to my mind is I know, and we all do, that many of us are the fortunate ones. We've been able to find the resources. Maybe we're lucky enough that we were able to keep working. We've got an extended family. We can buy these supplements. We can spend these thousands of dollars a month trying to get well. But it isn't happening universally. That there's got to be something more, and maybe that's what we're being pushed to figure out. Maybe necessity is the mother of invention here again, and that we're on the cutting edge of that. So I'm going to close with a little snippet of what Dr. Bruce Lipton teaches. And if you go to our website, trekfortruth.org, under the Health tab, you'll find a YouTube video of an hour-long talk that Dr. Lipton gives. And if you've never seen him, he looks like a little cherub. He's a jolly little guy, brilliant, but joyful, always upbeat, but just so enlightening and you'll watch this video and you'll feel more optimistic at the end of it than you will at the beginning, maybe you were at the beginning. So he uses the analogy of the butterfly, the caterpillar and the butterfly. And some of you all may have heard this before, but it really struck me when I heard him give it in this lecture, and it's stuck with me ever since. So when it's time for a butterfly to emerge from its caterpillarness, there are cells that start to show up in the body of the caterpillar, in small numbers at first. And you know what these cells are actually called by biologists? They're called imaginal cells. Imaginal cells. And they start showing up early on in small numbers,